Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us here. This is Abacode's SOC 2 webinar, which is an overview and readiness webinar for SOC 2. I'm Bryan Graf, SVP of Business Development here at Abacode. My background is in IT audit and compliance, so I've been a part of hundreds of SOC 2s over the years, and want to give you just an overview of what SOC 2 is and what can you expect going through an assessment and preparing for it. So before we even get into SOC 2, why do you need a SOC 2? Why are you here today? I doubt it's just a thirst of knowledge for compliance. It's because there is a driver that is driving your organization towards getting an attestation or an audit report. And those drivers are external and internal. In the past, they were mostly negative drivers. There are there's malware out there. There are bad actors trying to exfiltrate data and bring down your systems. Going through a SOC 2 or a similar type of audit prepares your organization to identify the risks that those bad actors present and the remediation that you have to put in place to stop those attacks from occurring and respond to them. There are positive drivers as well, which here at Abacode we like to focus on is there's usually a customer or a vendor or some other business opportunity that is requiring an organization to go through a SOC 2 because in order to sign up to get a new contract signed as part of the business agreement. Again, there's increasingly hostile threat environment, so organizations looking to outsource now understand that primary organizations and third-party service organizations are under attack by hackers, so they want some assurance that their data is going to be safe in a third party prior to handing it off to them. So that's the reason why you would get any sort of attestation. You are putting in a security program and you need third-party assurance because of a customer request or a regulatory request that security program is operating as intended. So what specifically is the SOC 2? It's a little bit different than the other standards that you may be familiar with, like ISO 27001 or NIST 853. Those are security standards that outline controls that an organization must put in place to be compliant with those programs. SOC 2 is actually an audit standard. It's not. It doesn't tell an organization how to be secure. It tells an auditor how to audit a process in order to put an opinion on it. This was done because back in early 2000s, Sarbanes-Oxley was passed, and a lot of organizations, the publicly traded organizations, had to get financial statement audits, and the CPAs had to opine on the IT controls, not just the financial statements. Well, they came to quickly realize that a lot of those controls are being handled by third parties, and they needed a way to quickly assess and transmit that information between organizations so that the primary could get through their Sarbanes-Oxley audits. So the SOC 2 started off as SAS 70, and it was basically a standard to let all financial, CPAs and financial auditors know if you're assessing this organization, do it this way, create this report, and then other auditors can use that report as evidence for their financial statements audits. So SOC 2 isn't going to have a list of controls that you need to implement to become SOC 2 compliant. There really is no SOC 2 compliance. What SOC 2 is and CPA has gone through a standardized audit process and is handing third parties an opinion of your security program. So why do you need a SOC 2? Well, usually it's because a customer is looking to procure your services, but first they need assurance that their data is going to be safe in your systems. So most organizations at this point of any size, but I would say almost all Fortune 1000 organizations, if they're going to purchase a service from you, they are most likely going to request a SOC 2. So that they have some assurance that if they give you that data, it's not going to get breached and that system is going to be available to use it when they need it. So why would a good benefit of a SOC 2 is that once you have it, your competitors may or may not have one, but you can automatically go to a higher tier of customer because you know that they're going to request this and you're going to have it preemptively. It's much better to have it than to get that request for a SOC 2 and state, well, I can get it done in 9 months or 10 months. And also the process helps you identify your risks and improve your organization's security posture. So not only do you have that SOC 2 and you're able to evidence that your program is in place, but also helps you identify any gaps and remediate issues before they become breaches or attacks. So an organization needs to balance when they get a request for a SOC 2. Obviously, it's going to be some work to implement the controls and to get the actual SOC 2 from a third party. So they need to balance what the positives are versus the costs of the SOC 2. It doesn't always make sense to go straight into a SOC 2. You might want to talk to your customers about putting together a roadmap and maybe getting SOC 2 within a year or so. As long as that customer is okay with your roadmap, then the agreement can continue. So what is a SOC 2? Well, basically it's an assessment of a service and the controls surrounding that service to determine whether the security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, or privacy of that data is assured. So there's two types of assessments. There's a type 1, which is a point in time assessment, meaning the day of the report, the auditor will state that these controls are in place and they're designed effectively. So even if they weren't in place a week before, that's okay. You can remediate up until the time the auditor is doing their field work, and the report will state that there are no deficiencies, there's no findings. A type 2 is a little bit more difficult to pass because it is over a period of time. So type 1 will look at a control, say background checks, and your controls state that all employees are required to have background checks before they are onboarded. For type 1, an auditor may just look at the process, maybe look at your new hire checklist and see, okay, there's a check mark for background checks. We have an example of one for this most recent new hire. So you pass the type 1 test. The type 2 is going to look at a sample of new hires over a review period, usually around 6 months. It can be up to a year, and say, okay, you had 100 new hires. I need to see the background checks for a sample of those. So that actually, type 2 will assess whether the control is actually working, not just is it in place, is it designed to do what it needs to do. And like I said before, SOC 2 may address up to 5 different attributes of the system: security, availability, confidentiality, processing integrity. So is the data I input into your system, is it input correctly? If I put 500 units, does it enter it in 500 units, and do I get the right price or the right specs or whatever it is that your system is outputting? Is that correct? So that's processing integrity. And then privacy is your compliance with privacy regulations, CCPA, GDPR. Do you have the privacy control in place to investigate privacy incidents, handle disclosures? If a customer or just any citizen calls you and has PII or personal information in your system, are you able to find it, and are you able to delete it if required by privacy law? That's what a SOC 2 assessment around privacy is. By far the most common assessments that a customer will require are security and availability. Is the data secure, and will the service be available if there's an incident? Can you spin it back up? So SOC 2 report is designed so that no matter who's doing the report, no matter what firm it is, what system or service that is being opined on, every SOC 2 report should look pretty much identical, and they all have these following components in them. The opinion letter, and that's where the auditor is going to tell you, this is what I found. Either I found nothing, which means an unqualified opinion. The organization said they were doing X things. I found no reason to believe that they are not doing these things. So you get a clean, what's called an unqualified opinion. The other type of opinion is called qualified, which sounds good, but it's not good. That means the auditor said, I looked at these 10 things and I found no evidence that there's nothing bad going on, but I have to qualify that for these 3 processes. I found X, Y, and Z. So it will spell out where the deficiencies were found and whether the criteria were still met or not. The management representation letter. So this is a thing that was born out of the Sarbanes-Oxley and the Enron crisis back in the late 1990s, 2000s. So for those of you who don't know about Enron, part of the reason that that Enron was such a disaster was prior to all that, there was not a specific management requirement for management to sign in writing, I am telling you the truth, Mr. Auditor or Mrs. Auditor, and you are, I'm not lying to you, and I will go to prison if I am lying to you. Prior to that, there was really no requirement for an employee to give the right evidence to an auditor, and this is making management now sign, yes, everything I'm giving you is correct to the best of my knowledge, I'm not misleading you, I'm not leaving anything out. So that's required in every report. System description, this is exactly what it says. You first describe the service that you're providing to your customer, and then you go into each layer, from the technology layer, the application and infrastructure, and the people layer, how to onboard, how to offboard your technical controls, how you manage access, how you manage changes, how you do your daily operations, how you restore services in the event of a disruption, how you detect and respond to incidents, and how you manage your vendors. So there's a flow that goes through that should be pretty uniform throughout the reports, although the system description is probably the one where there's the most variability. And then the control matrix. So we'll go through this a little bit more in detail later, but SOC 2, like I said, doesn't have a list of controls that you must implement. What it has is a list of criteria, and how you satisfy that criteria is up to you. So it will have, for instance, there's a criteria that says that you must be able to identify and remediate system flaws. In a nutshell, it's actually more descriptive than that. Well, there's lots of different ways you can do that depending on what type of service you have, if it's completely cloud-based, if it's technical, if it's a manual process. There may be different ways to identify flaws. You have to come up with the controls that describe how you are identifying and remediating those flaws. It is the auditor's job to then test that process, but it's not the auditor's job to come in and tell you how to satisfy the criteria. That's the job of management to do. The control matrix also has, for a type 2, it will have test steps. It'll tell you what the auditor did to test the design and effectiveness of that control, and the results, whether they had no findings or whether they tested a sample. If all 25 samples worked, then it'll say no findings, but it'll say one background check wasn't available. 1 out of 25 employees did not have a background check. So it'll be very descriptive. It doesn't give you subjective information. It just says, I tested this, this was in place, this was not. So how do you get ready for a SOC 2 assessment? And again, this is geared towards SOC 2, but really any audit, any assessment is going to follow these steps. So here at Abacode, we take you from, no matter where you are in the process, we can take you from step 1. If you've already done a risk assessment, we can take you from the implement to the manage piece all the way through the SOC 2 assessment. But it really doesn't matter. There are specificities to each type of standard, but this should be the flow that you follow no matter what audit standard you're looking to comply with. And these are the required components. Inventory, you have to know all the hardware and software systems that are involved with a service. Otherwise, how do you know your controls are really covering all the risks and all the risks for the system? Your risk assessment. Every standard, not just SOC 2, requires that the management apply controls based on a risk-based approach. So you perform an assessment, and then on an ongoing basis, you look at the results of that assessment and that risk register, and you're applying remediation to risks as you identify them and according to a scheduled process. Documented controls mapped criteria. So you want to make sure that you have identified all applicable criteria. They may not all be applicable to you. For instance, some criteria are specified for application development. So migrating code securely, maintaining a testing environment, things like that. If you don't do any development, then those criteria wouldn't apply to you. Control artifacts. So Once you have your controls in place and you know exactly what you're doing to satisfy the criteria, you have to be able to prove it. So you have to go through those processes and identify what is supposed to be generated by these controls. How do I know it was performed correctly? Some controls, very few of them, but some of them don't have any artifacts or maybe an observation or something like that. But most controls, especially ones that are on a scheduled basis, should generate something that you can show to an auditor to prove that that is happening on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. Program oversight and monitoring. So not only do you need to make sure the controls are operating effectively, meaning if there's a daily control, I should be able to pick a sample of days, and you should be able to show me that on those days that this control was operating as intended. You also want overall program oversight and monitoring. So I'm doing, as an auditor, I'm looking at these controls and making sure they're operating, but you should be doing that continually over time throughout the year. So you can do that in monthly or quarterly GRC meetings. I'm sure there's almost always an operations meeting that occurs weekly or monthly. That's a de facto program oversight. You're looking at your systems and your processes and making sure, if I've got a project that is 2 weeks behind, what's going on with that? If there's an issue with our network and our remote users having problems logging in, you're triaging these errors right now. What SOC 2 and what these assessment standards and these security standards do for you is formalize that process. So your executive team has the information and your operations team has the information to make changes to the system, to respond to incidents, and to respond to customer requests for new services, because they have that information and they're viewing it on an ongoing basis. So they're not surprised by things that pop up with new customers or incidents or things that are happening with the network. And then lastly, system description. This can be pieced together from marketing information, operations manuals, but basically a description of what the system does, what are customers expecting to get out of it, what is required to put into it, and all the controls for maintaining a secure function. So first, you want to make sure, again, you have to have an inventory. If you don't know all the systems and services, then how do you know you're applying the correct controls? So you want to list all hardware, software, cloud services, and data and scope. Anything that is required to provide the service. You want to make sure every system or software or anything has an asset owner and criticality. How do you assign criticality? It's based on the data that is that is stored in the system or the use of the system. So if you've got a Bastion host or some kind of VPN into, let's say, a federal system that's very high security. Okay, well, that system is obviously very high criticality. If something happens to that system, it could be a catastrophic impact to your organization. So you want to make sure all the hardware is listed. You know who to call if that hardware is malfunctioning. Who's assigned ownership of it and the sensitivity of it. You want to make sure you're reviewing the inventory periodically. So when you're standing up new servers or new systems, that part of that standing up process should be updating the inventory. And then you should be reviewing it periodically just to make sure you recognize all the assets on the inventory. You also want to make sure you reconcile it with vulnerability scans and vulnerability assessments that you're performing, because if an IP address pops up that you don't recognize, that's a pretty clear sign that something's wrong. So there's different ways to manage your asset inventory. If you have a rather simple, one service inventory, you might be able to just put it in a spreadsheet. At Abacode, we have different methods for maintaining our clients' inventories. We have a compliance portal that will maintain the inventory and keep information on it, or there are other services like Intune. A lot of the cloud solutions have the ability to generate inventories. You just want to make sure that there is a system of record and that it's being monitored and reviewed. Okay, the next thing is the risk and vulnerability assessment and penetration test. So this is basically the start of your program. You want to identify your risk management team, which should be key stakeholders and personnel that are able to make decisions regarding implementing security mechanisms or changes to the system. And you have to define the process for actually performing a risk assessment. You don't just, start the assessment. You have to have a defined process for it. Now, you don't have to define that process on your own. Most organizations use something like ISO 27005 or NIST 830. NIST 830 is a free document you can download from NIST, and it provides you step-by-step for how to perform a risk assessment. It's not the easiest reading. It's definitely pretty abstract, but if you follow that, you will have a risk assessment by the time you're done. And the point of a risk assessment is to identify internal strengths and weaknesses and external opportunities and threats. You want to make sure that those strengths and weaknesses are condensed into risks that are based on those weaknesses and those threats, and what those risks present in terms of impact to the organization. So again, there are a couple different ways to perform a risk assessment. If you're a small organization, you can keep that in a spreadsheet. If you're a larger organization with lots of controls, potentially lots of risks, Abacode recommends using a compliance portal to keep all of this straight, but we can use a compliance portal as well. The goal of this is to create a living document that you are going back to, and you have that list of risks and associated remediations, and you're tracking it on a quarterly basis. That's what the auditor is going to want to see, that you're identifying risks at a certain time, and that over time those risks are being remediated according to a schedule that you set. And that doesn't mean that you can't change that schedule. If you say, we know we have a risk of not of our endpoints not being managed securely, we're going to implement Intune within the next 3 months, and then a month later you have to push that off. That's okay, as long as you're in the risk assessment, in the risk register, you are documenting those tasks. It's up to management to determine what tasks are performed and what risks are accepted and mitigated. And you can alter that course. What the auditor will want to see is that there is continuous improvement and there's continuous input from the GRC team, and that the ship is being steered. You're not just implementing things on a reactive basis. So once you have your risks, you want to make sure you assign a value of likelihood and impact to the system. Threat plus likelihood is the risk to the organization. So if you have a data center in Florida, a risk could be hurricane. So if a hurricane comes in and hits my data center, it could be knocked out temporarily. It could be completely flattened. What is the likelihood of that happening? Well, it's pretty common in Florida, so you might want to put that as a medium likeliness. What is the impact of the organization? That could be medium to high based on the data center's build out and its ability to restore services in the event of a disaster. You want to identify compensating controls. So let's say you already have a failover Azure or AWS site ready to go in case your data center gets wiped out. Well, then that impact is lessened greatly by that compensating control. You probably don't have to do anything else, even though you identified a risk that is major impact. You've already got something in place that mitigates that risk. So your executive team can sign off that you can accept that residual risk. So you're doing all this because you want, in the end, a list of critical and high, moderate risks that you should be working towards to remediate and bring down to an acceptable level. That is the entire goal of this risk assessment, so that your executive team has a to-do list of things that they know based on all the information they have. These are the biggest risks of the organization. We have to work on these first. That is the crux of a risk-based approach. What I've just talked about in terms of risk assessment deals more with process, even though there is going to be technical assessment in a risk assessment. It's going to be interviews, it's going to be looking at documentation, things like that. That covers your process. Vulnerability assessments and penetration tests are going to identify the risks that are that are exposed because of your technical configuration, because you don't have the latest security updates, because you have insecure password configuration or network configuration. That'll give you your technical risks to remediate. So policies are the next step in implementing a program to get through SOC 2. So you need your risk assessment, you need to identify your controls and your criteria, and then a policy should be in place to help guide employees through every control. There may be some informal processes that you're performing, and the auditor may come on site and may give you a pass for it, but to be safe, you really should have a policy at least for every control. And then procedures should be in place to guide employees through the very critical processes, meaning access control. What is required to onboard an employee and offboard an employee? Now, before I grant you access to Active Directory, especially or an admin account, what assurances do I need? Do I need approval from a supervisor? Do I need a background check? Do I need a completed new hire checklist? Change management. This is how you onboard and offboard systems into your organization. Is there a testing process before you stand up a server? Are you making sure that server is built out correctly? Are you using golden images? Is there a change management board that meets and approves changes prior to implementation? How are you managing that? Application development. How are you, if you're coding, if you're providing an in-house developed application, how are you managing the coding process? Where is that code being stored? Are you testing in a secure environment? Do developers have access to production? There's controls for that. Incident response and business continuity disaster recovery. If an incident occurs, do you have a dedicated function that is there to detect and respond to the incidents? Do you have technology in place to detect incidents? And then once there is an outage or there is an incident, how do you respond to it? Do you have plans in place? Employee offboarding and offboarding. Are you doing background checks? Are you doing things like that to make sure the personnel that are in place are trained and know their jobs? And then offboarding as well. Are you making sure that terminated employees are removed from the system? Or are you giving exit interviews, things like that, and making sure that terminated employees are not a risk? And then vendor onboarding and offboarding. Is there a process for vetting new solutions? Do you have a vendor security checklist that you're sending out? Are you requesting that your vendors go through a SOC 2 or an ISO 27001 or some other sort of assessment just to give you comfort around that service? You need to have a formal process for that. So you need to make sure your controls are mapped to criteria, and you need to make sure every applicable criteria is met. So criteria could have one control, criteria could have several controls mapped to it, and one control could be mapped to several criteria. So it's not a one-to-one, it's usually a one-to-many. So here's an example. The entity responds to identified security incidents by defined incident response program. So the controls that this company has documented is that incidents are addressed according to a defined incident response plan, so they have a plan in place, and then there is a ticketing system used to document incident handling. So you can go into that ticketing system and actually see the process for the incident's been identified, it's now being investigated. Let's say the system was quarantined, so you have containment, you have eradication, there was a scan and the system was reimaged, and lessons learned. We determined that we need to reconfigure our endpoint protection because a certain malware got through or something like that. So these two controls map to this criteria and satisfy it. So control our artifacts. We talked about that a little bit before as well. So artifacts are generated by a control process, and they evidence that the control is being performed correctly. So an artifact can be different depending on the control, and there's not going to be a hard and fast rule for what artifacts are required by the auditor. So yeah, I just want to get you thinking as to what do I need to actually collect and what do I need to have on hand to prove that I'm actually doing what I'm saying. So what's the artifact for the following controls? Let's say systems are configured to enforce strong password requirements. So I will tell you, if I'm an auditor, there's a couple things I'm going to look at. I want to see what are the requirements? Do you have those documented in access control policy? And let's say you have policy that says that passwords must be 12 characters, must have upper lowercase. Okay, that's one piece of evidence. What's the second thing I would do? Well, I would actually go into Active Directory and make sure that it's actually configured the way that the policy says. Those are the two those are the two artifacts I would look at for control, like the first one. For the second one, it's a little bit easier. Vulnerability assessment is performed on an annual basis. So for that, I would want to hopefully there's a policy for vulnerability management that states how often the assessments are going to be performed. And then I would ask for the most recent assessment. So if it's dated within a year, then I know that they're doing them at least annually. And then employees are required to undergo a background check prior to onboarding. I went over this one before. It's a very simple one, but if you want to see if there's a policy, you might want to interview the HR manager and make sure that they're aware of that. And then you want to ask for a sample of background checks. So again, just like with the risk assessment with the inventory, if you've got a smaller environment, you can map it in an Excel spreadsheet, but I will tell you that there's usually around 60 to 100 controls for a SOC 2 assessment. If you're starting to map multiple assessments, multiple systems, there's delta in between those systems. It's probably better to start in a compliance portal, which takes you through the entire process. So Abacode offers our own compliance portal that we can manage for you. But it will take you through the entire process so that you don't have a risk assessment in one spreadsheet, you have your controls in another spreadsheet, and the information is never shared and it's not usable. You want to make sure that there's a central repository where the control owners can go in and document that they've done the control. An auditor or compliance personnel internally can upload evidence that the control is being performed, and then you can now also give your auditors access to it, and that speeds up the audit process as well. A lot of auditors will actually require that you upload documents into a repository for their access. So this helps expedite that process. So you've got your risk assessment, you've got your policies and procedures, you've implemented your controls, and you've made sure that the controls are mapped to your to the applicable criteria. Like I talked about earlier, it's not just about the controls though, it's about your oversight of the controls. So a SOC 2 assessor is going to want to determine, do you have a process to identify and mitigate non-technical risks? So that's going to be proven by your risk assessment, your GRC meetings, the documentation in your risk register, showing that on an ongoing basis you're reviewing that information. Does the organization have can you identify and mitigate technical risks? Part of that will be in your risk management process and your risk assessment. That also is going to be in your vulnerability assessment. Can the organization mitigate risks in a timely manner? So are you doing risk management meetings? Are you on an ongoing basis? Is this something that is being reviewed and updated by executive management? Also, in terms of technical risks, they're going to be looking at a patch management process. So if you're performing vulnerability scans on a scheduled basis, that's great. But what are you doing with those assessments? So now you have 10 critical vulnerabilities. Are you patching them, or is the same scan showing the same vulnerabilities popping up over and over again? That's going to be a sign to an auditor that you're identifying the risk, but you're not mitigating them. The fourth bullet, can you detect security incidents? So do you have a SIM in place? Do you have security operations? First off, do you have someone who has been tasked with identifying security incidents? Because if not, then it's not going to get done. It has to be someone's responsibility. Does that person have the tools they need to actually detect incidents? Do they have access to security logs? Do they get alerted when, let's say, a new system is stood up on the network, or is there a SIM in place that is aggregating logs and alerting on unusual activity? Without these mechanisms, it's very difficult for someone to actually identify and respond to a security incident. And then once there is an incident, because no matter what you put in place, incidents are still going to happen, and it is not it's not the goal of a security program to prevent every incident, because that's not possible. We understand that some incidents are going to happen, so it is just as vital for us to be able to respond to them as it is to detect and prevent them. So can we restore services and data if there is an incident in place? So we're going to look at your BCDR, your operations. Are you backing up data? Are you backing up server images? Are you able to then take those backed up images and data and restore services? Do you have a system that requires 24-hour, never off service? If you have something critical like some sort of health services where a doctor or someone has to be able to access this system at any given point in time, or else someone's health could be at risk, then that system probably needs a failover hot site. If you're doing something that doesn't require that, and you're doing maybe some kind of consulting or something that doesn't require 24-hour immediate access, maybe your BCDR plan is, within 8 hours or within 4 hours, I'll have my repository back up and running and I can resume business operations. So BCDR and incident response means something different depending on the risk to your organization. And then finally, a system description. System description must document your system boundary, meaning beyond this firewall, I have no control over the security of the systems or the data. Beyond this firewall, inside, everything is our responsibility. Critical assets and data, again, from the asset inventory, key stakeholders and personnel, not just executives that are making the decisions, but who's actually in charge of performing these services. Description of the service provided. So, data center hosting, you're going to talk about, do you provide co-location? Do you provide managed hosting? You want to make sure you're specific and you describe the system, the services that you're providing. Your risk assessment process. In the past, this used to be canned language in a SOC 2, but now the auditors are requiring you to go in and describe how you're identifying, how you establish this process, and on an ongoing basis, how you're identifying and mitigating risks. Access control process. How are you onboarding customers? If this is a web-based application, how are you onboarding employees? How are you granting admin access, standard access? How are you controlling access and terminating it when it's no longer needed? Change management and application development, we went over. How are you making changes to the system? And if you're coding, how are you making changes to the code? And how are you ensuring that only authorized changes are being made? IR and BCDR, we've gone over that several times. And then monitoring function, how are you currently able to determine if there's any incident in the system? Okay, so how long does all this take to implement? Well, it's going to differ wildly based on the size of the system, the overall maturity of the security function within the organization, if they already have security policies, if they've gone through an assessment in the past versus never going through this before. Obviously, that is going to increase your timeline. But I would say this is a pretty standard timeline for an organization starting from ground zero that has a standard size web application that needs to go through a SOC 2. You're probably looking at 12 months to the time you actually have your SOC 2 report in hand from the time you start getting your inventory together. That can be shortened to 6 to 9 months using a consultant that is just able to gather the information and put it together quicker. Abacode, we usually can get through a one service application SOC 2 from start to finish, usually within 9 months is usually the target date. So, but these are the tasks you're going to go through. The first month is to do that risk assessment, vulnerability assessment, putting together your inventory and your description and getting all that together. Months 3 to 9 is where the majority of the work is going to be, where you're drafting your policies, you're making sure that your processes are documented where they need to be, and then implementing those processes and also making sure there's oversight of those processes. And then finally, management, make sure you're generating audit artifacts. And management says month 9 to 12, but that really, management's month 9 ongoing. It never stops because you're always going to be generating audit artifacts. You're going to be testing your BCDR and IR plans. You're going to be performing vulnerability assessments and patching ongoing according to a defined schedule. So that is pretty much all you need to do to get ready for a SOC 2. And that is the end of the webinar. Again, my name is Bryan Graf. I think we're going to now open it up to questions, Dustin.
Yes. Looks like we have a question here. How long does a SOC?
How long does a SOC 2 take? I assume that means the actual audit itself. So a SOC 2 is going to be a minimum 2-week to 4-week engagement, meaning the auditors will be, some on field, some off field, but they will be performing field work for 2 to 4 weeks. Then usually it takes 5 to 8 weeks to get you the report. So just think about 3 months from the time you start the process to the time you get it is the maximum you should be waiting.
Thank you, Bryan.
Again, that will increase if you're, I've been on SOC 2s where just the field work has taken 2 months and the reports take another 2 months to get. So.
All right, thank you for that. And then we also have, if starting from scratch, how long would it be ready for us to?
So, like I said in that last slide, I would give yourselves a year, and that's, a year should be enough for most organizations to get through on their own. If you need to get through before that, and you're gonna be audited, I would suggest speaking to a consultant, at least getting their lay of the land for how long they think it will take, and then make the determination as to whether you need help putting this together or you can get through it on your own. I don't know if I answered the question, but 12 months, I would say, for a organization starting from scratch, 9 months for an organization using a consultant starting from scratch.
All right, Bryan. Looks like we covered all the questions we have here. So if you maybe wanted to let people know how to get in contact with us, we'll close it out.
Yeah, you can go to abacode.com, and we have a lot of information there. I'm on LinkedIn, obviously, and again, I'm SVP of Business Development here. So if you have any questions about our services, and my background is in GRC, so specifically I put together these programs. So you can email me. I'm on LinkedIn, or go to the site, and we can help you out.